Thank you all for being here, despite the terrible weather, or maybe the bountiful rain that flourishes, helps us to grow, or whatever. I think it's terrible weather. So thank you all for being here despite the rain. We were in for a real treat tonight, so we really appreciate you making the effort. A couple announcements before I introduce our speakers and before we get started. First of all, please turn off the ringers of your cell phones so that we're not distracted during our conversation. Second of all, my name is Eric Owens. I'm the Associate Director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life, and we're the sponsors of today's lecture. And we also have a few other upcoming events that I wanted to make you aware of. In 2 weeks, on December 1st, we have our final event of the semester by Gregor Scherzinger, a visiting scholar at the Boise Center from Switzerland. He'll be talking, giving a lunch talk called How God Commands Religious Liberty, Islamic Minarets and Liberal Democracy. It's going to be a terrific talk, and I hope you'll join us for that. And then next semester we have, I won't list everything that we've got going on, but we have panels on religion in the military, religion in the presidential race. We have a major lecture by theologian Miroslav Volf, and we have lunch talks on everything from African American conservatism to Catholic social thought and community organizing. We've got a lot of great stuff going on, and we hope you'll join us for all that stuff. But today you're here for a different reason, and it's my pleasure to begin today by introducing our speaker as well as our respondent, and then Professor Jacobs will talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then Professor Wilt will speak, give about a 10-minute response, and then we will have a conversation with you all. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Jacobs. He's the Clyde Kilby Professor of English at Wheaton College in Illinois, where he's taught since 1984. His teaching and scholarly interests include modern British and Commonwealth literature, hermeneutics, literary theory, and the history of criticism, as well as Christian theology and literature. He's the editor or author of 11 books, by my count at least, I could be off, including A Theology of Reading, The Hermeneutics of Love, The Narnian, The Life and Imagination of C.S. Lewis, Original Sin, A Cultural History, Shaming the Devil, Essays in Truth-Telling, and most recently, The Pleasures of Reading in an Age of Distraction. And the last one's a book I've been meaning to get to forever, but my email keeps ringing and I can't quite get to it. So hopefully soon I will be. But several of these I have read, in terrific, provocative work. So it's our pleasure to have him here. His undergraduate degree is from the University of Alabama, and his doctorate in English is from the University of Virginia. So welcome, Professor Jacobs. He'll be, following his lecture, Professor Judith Wilt will be responding. Professor Wilt is the Wheaton College Alumnae Chair in Western Culture, Emerita, here in the Boston College English Department. A founding member of BC's Women's Studies program, she was chair of the English Department from 1990 to 1996. Her areas of expertise include 19th century British fiction, women's writing, religion and literature, and popular culture genres, especially Gothic fiction. She's the author of at least 5 books by my count, including Ghosts of the Gothic, Austen, Eliot, and Lawrence, a book called Abortion, Choice, in Contemporary Fiction, The Armageddon of the Maternal Instinct, and Behind Her Times, Transition England in the Novels of Mary Arnold Ward. Her PhD is from Indiana University, and we're so delighted to have both of you here. So Professor Jacobs, you're up first.
Thanks for coming out in the rain. I much appreciate it. So what I'm going to do today is to talk around the quotations which are on the handout that you should have. And you'll see how that works. So this will not be a lecture as such, but, well, I guess it will be. It'll just be a different sort of lecture. So I want to begin by telling you where when I really started thinking about these issues. Every other year, Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, has a festival of faith and writing, which has burgeoned over the years into this enormous thing. Thousands of people show up and take over the whole city of Grand Rapids, and there are literally, I think maybe 200 speakers or something like that, and they're generally, a handful of keynote speakers. The largest addresses can draw 1,500, 2,000 people to see. It's just crazy. Kind of in a wonderful sort of way, but also sort of overwhelming. I was there some years ago with, I was asked to speak, over in a corner somewhere, and the festival keynoter, so to speak, the highlight, was a novelist named Frederick Buechner. Some of you will know as he's a fellow New Englander, lives in Vermont most of the year. And Buechner, whom I've known for many years, is someone who is he's one of these people who, as he has said himself, his books have always gotten absolutely wonderful reviews and then sold 8,000 copies. And so he's a sort of a marginal figure in some respects, very highly praised by many of his fellow writers, but he sort of reached the peak of his fame when his first novel was published when he was 24 years old, and he ended up on the cover of Time magazine. And it's sort of been all downhill from then in terms of his fame, though not of the quality of his writing, which I think has been extraordinarily high and consistently high over the decades. So Buechner was going to be one of the featured speakers here, and in fact they ended up having to move this to one of the largest, I think the largest church in Grand Rapids, because something like 3,000 people wanted to show up to hear this guy speak. Again, it's very little known in the literary and cultural world at large, but in this world of sort of Christian readers, he's an absolute rock star. I mean, it was just the hordes of people gathering around him. And so at one point, in the little conference center that they have there, the people who organized the conference had sort of sequestered him in this little out-of-the-way room and had people guarding the doors, so that the great unwashed would not come and disturb the great man. But as old friends of his, my wife and I were allowed access to the inner sanctum, and we sat there with Fred for a couple of hours and chatted with him sort of in between visits of people who, for whatever reason, I think in many cases, I think all the cases that I know of, they were either highly valued speakers who were going to be talking at the conference, or they were people who were major donors to the conference who got to have audience with Fred. So it was you sort of felt like you were sitting in the papal chambers, and then somebody was being ushered in, and the people who came in with that kind of reverence. I mean, if he had had a ring, I'm sure they would have knelt to kiss it. But and I kept hearing the same story over and over again. People would say, I want to thank you because I'm a Christian because of your books, or I'm a believer because of your books, or I wouldn't be a believer if it weren't for your books. And that same story was repeated over and over again. And I thought, on the one hand, while I understand that, I know what they're seeing in those books, I know what they're experiencing, I've read them myself, and I know what they're like, I know the beauty of them. But it sort of occurred to me, what an odd thing. That's a historically odd thing. And I've sort of been thinking about it off and on over the years, trying to understand it historically, sociologically, theologically. And what I'm going to say today is, I think, just a kind of a framework of a response to this phenomenon, which is built to some degree on historical research and built to some degree on some categories that have been provided by Charles Taylor in his magisterial book, A Secular Age. So with that, I want to sort of plunge in, and with that sort of background, so you understand the questions that I'm trying to address, and start looking at the quotations on the handout. The first quotation goes like this: God is at work not only in overtly spiritual things, devotionals and memoirs, liturgies and hymns, but also in the imaginative lives of God's people in their sub-creative worlds, as J.R.R. Tolkien put it, in their carefully crafted turns of phrase. That's Sarah Arthur in the introduction to a book which is actually a kind of a distinct subgenre, though it doesn't really have a name. It's, I think if I were going to call it something, I would call it a literary lectionary. That is, there are half a dozen of these that I can think of off the top of my head, books which are gatherings of choice quotations from literary authors, arranged in a kind of lectionary-like format so that you have readings for a season or readings for a day. So you can find, 365 days of readings from C.S. Lewis, or 365 days of readings from G.K. Chesterton, or for that matter, there's one for Frederick Buechner as well. A daily reading. You're doing your lectionary. It becomes like a little prayer book, right? And so that's a very recent phenomenon. There's a kind of a predecessor to it in John Keeble's great collection of poems, The Christian Year, from the 1830s. But to see these things sort of pouring off the presses and people treating anthologies or collections of literary quotations as though they have a kind of a liturgical and lectionarial heft is a pretty new phenomenon, a pretty curious phenomenon. And it's the idea behind all of these texts is that they are going to provide people with a way into religious experience that those people might not be able to get through churches, through pastors, through formal teachers of the faith. That it's got to be, there's something more appealing about it being done through this kind of side door or back door. And that, in fact, is a phenomenon which extends far beyond literature. I have a quotation here from an interview that Bob Dylan gave to John Pareles of Newsweek magazine in 1997, when Pareles was asking him what everybody was asking Dylan in those days. Didn't you have this big conversion to Christianity in the 80s, and then what happened to that? And Dylan says, here's the thing with me and the religious thing. This is the flat-out truth. I find the religiosity and philosophy in the music. I don't find it anywhere else. Songs like Let Me Rest on a Peaceful Mountain or I Saw the Light, that's my religion. I don't adhere to rabbis, preachers, evangelists, all of that. I've learned more from the songs than I've learned from any of this kind of entity. The songs are my lexicon. I believe the songs. And I actually think, Dylan actually may be misspeaking there. He may not mean lexicon. He may mean lectionary. He may mean prayer book. But I think either way, even if you take him to mean lexicon, he's saying this is the vocabulary of my faith, the vocabulary that I get from the songs. And I think it's just as important, or maybe even more important, that he said, more important than that he says, I believe the songs, is that he says, I don't adhere to rabbis, preachers, evangelists, or any of this kind of entity. I don't get it there. And that's the phenomenon that I want to try to account for. Why do you get it from the songs or the poems or the stories, and you don't get it from the rabbis, the preachers, the evangelists? Why is that? The next quotation gets us into the next section. You can see I've divided these up into sections. And I want to look at 3 examples of this phenomenon from sort of ranging from the end of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century. The first one is from Simone Weil, one of her long letters to Father Perrin, who was her kind of unofficial or maybe official confessor, to whom she wrote a lot of letters trying to explain the development of her spirituality. She wrote to Father Perrin in 1938, I spent 10 days at the monastery of Solam from Palm Sunday to Easter Tuesday, following all the liturgical services. At this point, Simone Weil would have considered herself to be obviously ethnically Jewish, but someone who had an ambiguous relationship to the practice of Judaism. There was a young English Catholic there from whom I gained my first idea of the supernatural power of the sacraments because of the truly angelic radiance with which he seemed to be clothed after going to communion. So there she's having an experience within the context of the official worship of the church that's strong. We don't want to say that it's not. But then she goes on to say chance, for I always prefer saying chance rather than providence, this is kind of the typical stubbornness of Simone Weil and not wanting to cave in to easy theological language. Chance made of him a messenger to me, for he told me of the existence of those English poets of the 17th century who were named metaphysical. In reading them later on, I discovered the poem of which I read you what is unfortunately a very inadequate translation. It is called Love. I learned it by heart. And this seems to be George Herbert's Love 3, the third of his poems called Love. The most famous one, Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. Often, she says, I learned it by heart. Often at the culminating point of a violent headache, I made myself say it over, concentrating all my attention upon it and clinging with all my soul to the tenderness it enshrines. I used to think I was merely reciting it as a beautiful poem, but without my knowing it. This is absolutely central to the experience that I'm trying to account for. Without my knowing it, the recitation had the virtue of a prayer. It was during one of these recitations that, as I told you, Christ himself came down and took possession of me. While reciting this poem, which had the virtue of a prayer, though it had the virtue of the prayer, I want to say not in spite of the fact, but because of the fact that she did not know that was happening, that she was not experiencing it as a prayer. She thought she was merely reciting it as a beautiful poem. This is essential to the experience. Here's a second example from C.S. Lewis. This is the introduction that he wrote to a collection of readings by George MacDonald, which, by the way, could themselves be used in a kind of a liturgical or lectionarial way. What reading George MacDonald's Fantasies actually did to me was to convert, even to baptize my imagination. Here's the key phrase here, baptize my imagination. It did nothing to my intellect, nor at that time to my conscience. Their turn came far later and with the help of many other books and men. But when the process was complete, by which of course I mean when it had really begun, I found that I was still with MacDonald and that he had accompanied me all the way, and that I was now at last ready to hear from him much that he could not have told me at that first meeting. But in a sense, what he was now telling me was the very same that he had told me from the beginning. Now that's an interesting thing as well, right? It is. Lewis says it was this. When he read MacDonald for the first time, he was a self-professed atheist and was very firm and clear in his atheism. He was studying with the tutor, whom he later called the Great Knock, a man named W.T. Kirkpatrick. And Kirk was, or the Knock, he had many nicknames, was himself a very staunch atheist of the, as Lewis said, the old 19th century Victorian high and dry rationalistic model. He certainly wasn't going to church or receiving any kind of religious instruction, but he wouldn't have been willing to receive any religious instruction, but reading MacDonald baptized his imagination. That is, he was getting a kind of preparatio evangelium, right? A preparation for the gospel, but again, without knowing it. That's essential, that it's without knowing it. It wasn't until years later that he was able to, as it were, retell the story and say. I mean, he would not have said when he was 16 years old, whoa, I've just had my imagination baptized. He wouldn't have put it in anything like those kinds of religious or theological terms. And in fact, I think he would say that it was only because he was completely unaware that anything religious or spiritual was going on that he was able to receive the baptism, which would then prove to be consequential 15 years later, when the ground had been prepared. That's at least how he would tell the story. And I want you to notice that both in the case of Simone Weil and the case of Lewis, that literature is proving to be a kind of an entryway into orthodox traditional forms of Christianity. That's a little bit different than the story that I'm going to read next, which is from William Hale White's book. He wrote under the name Mark Rutherford, and he called this the autobiography of Mark Rutherford. This is late Victorian, right? So he says, the book was published in 1982. One day in my his third year at college, he was going to a dissenting academy. Right, so one of the schools established by the dissenters from the Church of England. So they would have been Congregationalists or Presbyterians, and that's where he was studying. So it was his third year, so this would have made him a teenager about Lewis's age. A day I remember as well as Paul must have remembered afterwards the day on which he went to Damascus. I happened to find amongst a parcel of books a volume of poems in paper boards. It was called Lyrical Ballads. And I read first one and then the whole book. It conveyed to me no new doctrine, and yet the change it wrought in me could only be compared with that which is said to have been wrought on Paul himself by the divine apparition. My Damascus Road experience was an encounter not with Jesus but with Wordsworth. Right? There is, of course, a definite explanation to be given of one effect produced by the Lyrical Ballads. God is nowhere formally deposed, and Wordsworth would have been the last man to say he had lost his faith in the God of his fathers, but his real God is not the God of the church, but the God of the hills, the abstraction nature, and to this my reverence was transferred. Instead of an object of worship which was altogether artificial, remote, never coming into genuine contact with me, I now had one which I thought to be real, one in which literally I could live and move and have my being, an actual fact present before my eyes. God was brought from that heaven of the books and dwelt on the downs and the faraway distances and in every cloud shadow which wandered across the valley. Wordsworth unconsciously did for me what every religious reformer has done. He recreated my supreme divinity, substituting a new and living spirit for the old deity once alive, but gradually hardened into an idol. So you see the difference here, right? I mean, for William Hale White, this is a kind of a conversion to a sort of a semi-transcendentalism or a pantheism, a kind of nature worship. And so it's not just it's not a matter of getting into traditional or Orthodox Christianity through a side door. It's a matter of being delivered from traditional or Orthodox Christianity and entering into that. That God is dead. That God is nothing more than an idol, right? But the God of nature is a new God to whom he transfers his allegiance. Now that's a kind of a common story, right? I mean, that one's one that we know. I bring it here and juxtapose it to the stories of Lewis and Vey because in order to show how different theirs are. That it's a literary conversion to orthodoxy, not a literary conversion to pantheism or to transcendentalism. Now, if you look at this matter historically, it's pretty hard to find examples of the kind of experience that Simone Weil and Lewis have that are much more than 150 years old. In fact, maybe even 100 years old. It's very, very rare. It's a very recent phenomenon. Let me just give you a couple of contrasting examples. The next quote I have is from Boccaccio's Life of Dante. And if you read Boccaccio's Life of Dante with a sort of an unbiased eye and you just sort of come to it innocently, the thing that is almost certain to strike you more forcibly than anything else is how much Boccaccio feels that Dante needs to be defended on theological grounds. That is, for Boccaccio, he expects that his audience will see the writing of poetry as something intrinsically shameful. And so what you've got to do is to show how it is actually possible to write about poetry in a way that is consistent with Christian teaching. So listen to what he says. The subject of sacred poetry is divine truth, while that of the ancient poets is men and the gods of the pagans. So poetry for him is just, it's just, we have sacred truth in the Bible, and then we have all this pagan poetry. They are opposites insofar as theology, Boccaccio says theology when he means Scripture. That's the word he uses for Scripture, which is interesting. They are opposites insofar as theology proposes nothing that is not true. Poetry supposes certain things to be true which are most false and erroneous and contrary to the Christian religion. Notice he doesn't say pagan poetry, he just says poetry, as though it's just kind of the nature of poetry, to be this tissue of lies. Nevertheless, I say that theology and poetry may be said to be almost one thing when the subject is the same, and I say further that theology is nothing else than the poetry of God. The sense of our comedy, whether you call it moral or theological, is, at whatever part of the work it most pleases you, the simple and immutable truth, which not only cannot receive corruption, but the more it is searched, the greater odor of incorruptible sweetness it emits to those who regard it. And if you look at this in the whole context, what Boccaccio is saying throughout is that my standard, my canon, my rule, by which I judge everything, is theology, which is to say Scripture. That's what he... And so how does he... The only way he can defend Dante as a poet is by saying what Dante teaches in the Divine Comedy is consistent with what Scripture and the Church teach. Therefore, it's okay. Therefore, it's incorruptible. But it's only incorruptible by virtue of being measured against this canon, this standard, this rule of Scripture and found adequate to it. That is, it is not an independent, self-sufficient, freestanding witness to God. It is of value only insofar as you can show that it corresponds to the sacred text, which you hold to be true on other grounds. Similarly, if you look at the incredible devotion that 18th and early 19th century poets had for Milton, which they largely did, you'll find that though Milton claimed prophetic status and announced in Paradise Lost that he was seeking the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and that he trusted that he was receiving it, that's not how they respond to him. They see him rather as a poetic father. And I just love this. This is a fabulous passage from a letter that William Cowper, the deeply disturbed but also sweet-natured William Cowper, wrote to a friend of his. He wrote to him and said, "You're not going to believe the dream I had. I dreamed that being in a house in the city and with much company, looking towards the end of the room from the upper end of it, I descried a figure which I immediately knew to be Milton's. He was very gravely but very neatly attired in the fashion of his day and had a countenance which filled me with those feelings that an affectionate child had for a beloved father. My first thought was wonder where he could have been concealed so many years. My second, a transport of joy to find him still alive." This is 120 years after Milton's death. My second, a transport of joy to find him still alive. My third, another transport to find myself in his company. And my fourth, a resolution to accost him. I did so, and he received me with a complaisance in which I saw equal sweetness and dignity. I spoke of his Paradise Lost, as every man must who is worthy to speak of it at all, and told him a long story of the manner in which it affected me when I first discovered it, being at that time a schoolboy. He answered me by a smile and a gentle inclination of his head. He then grasped my hand affectionately, and with a smile that charmed me said, "Well, you for your part will do well also." At last, recollecting his great age, for I understood him to be 200 years old, I feared I might fatigue him by much talking. I took my leave, and he took his with an air of the most perfect good breeding. And I think that's absolutely appropriate. You know, you got to let those 200-year-olds have some time to rest and relax. You know, but it's all, notice that it's all paternal, and it doesn't have. Even though Cowper was in his moments of sanity, a devout Christian. And even in his moments of madness was someone who felt that he had been excluded against his will from the kingdom of God. He doesn't talk about Milton in theological or spiritual terms. He talks about him as a poetic father. And in fact, if you look at Samuel Johnson's Life of Milton, one of the things that Johnson does over and over again is to compare what Milton writes with the teachings of Scripture and the church and finding him lacking. Saying, well, this is all very good, but he's a great, great poet, but... So there's this sense in which you have a standard by which literature is being judged that is extra literary. And that's very different from the experience that we were talking about at the beginning. Just trying to understand that change, that shift, is the hard part. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but if you look at that next section, I just put it there for you to refer to later on. As I've tried to discover this, the first writer that I can find who becomes a kind of a freestanding prophetic witness to Christian truth is not an English writer or an American writer or a French or a German writer, but a Russian one. It's Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is the first one. And there's a fascinating passage in Joseph Frank's, in the last volume of Joseph Frank's biography of Dostoevsky, when he's trying to, it's the beginning of the last volume where he says, you know, there's something really strange that happened in the 1870s, and that was that all of these radical leftists who hated the Orthodox Church nevertheless loved Dostoevsky, even though he was, by their criteria, an absolutely reactionary right-winger. But they loved him, they adored him, and they accepted him as bearing a kind of a prophetic witness that the church, the Orthodox Church itself, was too corrupt ever to bring. And so he's the first example I can find, and you can see, and he clearly thought of himself that way, as these quotations will show. I just want you to know that they're there, and you can look at them later on. See, this is why it's worth coming out here. You get something free to take home that'll be worth, you know, no additional charge, and you get to take home the words of wise people. So I just want to call your attention to that Dostoevsky is the first writer I can find who stands for a significant number of people in that role of being someone whose prophetic witness is not dependent on his being connected to the church, any church, or to the particular readings of Scripture. It's like he's just bearing witness, in a sense, almost to his own revelation of Christian truth. That was how he was treated. And Frank says it's the great mystery is that in Russia in the 1870s, where the left and the right couldn't agree on anything, this they agreed on, that Dostoevsky was a prophetic voice. So that's the first example that I can see. But what happens is that during the course of the 20th century, this phenomenon becomes more and more pronounced. And there are more and more people who will say what those people came in to say to Frederick Buechner, which is that I am a Christian or I am a believer because of your books, or I would not be a believer if it were not for your books. There's people for whom church membership or participation in a kind of a daily religious community is not attractive at all. And in fact, I think for people who come into Christianity through this kind of side door or back door, participating in the kind of boring quotidian life of a religious fellowship can be pretty disappointing and disenchanting in comparison. So why is it that it works like this? Why is it that there are so many people, and there are many of them, in fact there may be some in this room today, who would say something like this, that there's a kind of religious or spiritual witness that I can receive through literature and through the other arts that I just can't receive any other way, and I certainly can't receive from the rabbis, preachers, and evangelists that Dylan talks about, and that kind of entity. Right? Why? So what's this all about? I think you can close in on it by looking at these last few passages that we have here. I have two passages from C.S. Lewis, written in the same year, which I think are very illuminating, and illuminating in ways that maybe Lewis wouldn't particularly like. Lewis was always getting letters from people after he wrote the Narnia books saying, ooh, how did you do that? And, how did you decide that you were going to illustrate the theology of baptism through Eustace's undragoning or whatever it was? And Lewis was kind of frustrated by these things, and he said in this essay, some people seem to think that I began by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children, then fixed on the fairy tale as an instrument, then collected information about child psychology and decided what age group I'd write for, then drew up a list of basic Christian truths and hammered out allegories to embody them. This is pure moonshine. I couldn't write in that way at all. It is better not to ask the questions, what do children want and what do children need, at all. Let the pictures tell you their own moral, the pictures that arise in your mind. For the moral inherent in them will rise from whatever spiritual roots you have succeeded in striking during the whole course of your life. Which I think, by the way, is very good advice to writers. But he also says this. He says, if you're going to understand how I write, you have to understand that there's the author and the man. And the author has certain purposes and the man has other purposes. So he says, on that side, the side of the author, I wrote fairy tales because the fairy tale seemed the ideal form for the stuff I had to say. Then, of course, the man in me began to have his turn. I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. And reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if it were something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could not one thus steal past those watchful dragons? In which he seems to be admitting that he did exactly what he said in that first quotation he wasn't doing. And he does it by saying, well, there's this kind of, I'm this bifurcated self. You know, there's the part of me that just wants to tell fairy tales, but then there's the part of me that says, but I could use these fairy tales in order to illustrate certain doctrines or certain truths. And that dividedness, that sense of being, you know, sort of at cross purposes is, I think, really key to this phenomenon. Look at this next quotation from Sarah Arthur, where she's, and I'm not going to read all of that, I'm just going to just mention it briefly. She's perfectly aware that when you make an anthology of, a sort of a lectionary-like anthology of quotations from poets and authors, and you hand them to people, and you associate it with the church year, that you're sort of saying, here, take spiritual nourishment from this. But at the same time, she knows that if you tell people to take spiritual nourishment, they will say no. They don't want spiritual nourishment. They don't want to take their medicine, right? And so she says, you know, these readings might as well come with neon signs saying, warning, powerful spiritual moment ahead, which is tantamount to robbing them of all potential impact. By including these excerpts, I do not insist that you be profoundly moved by each of them. Some will disappoint, others will bewilder. What is a spiritual encounter for one person may not be for another. So, on the one hand, she's saying, here, read this for spiritual nourishment. But no, you don't really have to. No, just, it's okay. Because she knows that if we feel that we're being commanded, or that we're being instructed directly, that we will resist the directness of instruction. And so, just as Lewis does, she sort of has to give with one hand and take away with the other. And I think that when people respond in this way, I think what they're doing is responding in a way that is frankly, and I think we're trying, and I include myself as someone in this group, I think we're sort of trying to court self-deception. That is, we want to receive spiritual instruction without admitting that we're receiving spiritual instruction. We want to tell ourselves we're just reading a story, just for fun, and then we're sort of hoping that spiritual instruction will come. But on the other hand, we never want to say that we're really reading it for the spiritual instruction, because that turns it into kind of drudgery. And I think this has a lot to do with the categories that Charles Taylor speaks about in A Secular Age, of the difference between what he calls the porous and the buffered self. The pre-modern self for him is the porous self. That is, you are continually at the mercy of spiritual powers that are outside you. And you spend a great deal of your energy as an individual and as a community in trying to control and limit the power of these spiritual entities. You live in a world that is not, as Flannery O'Connor said of the South, Christ-haunted. You live in a world in which Christ is Lord, but which there are demonic powers everywhere. The demonic powers are what make you sick when you get sick. Angelic powers are the ones that can protect you from getting sick if you happen not to when other people around you are getting sick. You are porous. Yourself is porous. Demonic possession is widely recognized as an explanation for strange behavior. So you don't have the buffers that the modern person does. The buffered self of the modern world is one, Taylor says, that gives you an enormous amount of protection. But you get that protection at the cost of feeling isolated from the cosmos. So it's a huge trade-off. And I think that what we see in this, my sort of general guess as what's going on in this phenomenon, is we have people who want to have and I count myself as one of these people. I'll just put it in that way. I want to have the access to spiritual wisdom, spiritual insight, and spiritual power that was available to people in a pre-modern age, the age of the porous self. But I want it without being vulnerable to the dark forces of the porous self. In other words, I want to have porosity. I want to be able to open the doors when I want to open the doors, and I want to be able to shut them to have my buffers in place when I need to do that. I'm trying to have cake and eat it too, right? I'm trying to do two things simultaneously, and I think that's why I put myself in a situation where I'm reading books and trying to tell myself that I'm not reading them for spiritual instruction, but only for entertainment, only for delight, when another part of me actually wants to receive the spiritual instruction. This was something that Kierkegaard saw coming. And in the middle of the 19th century, he writes in this last quotation, "An illusion can never be destroyed directly, and only by indirect means can it be radically removed. A direct attack only strengthens a person in his illusion and at the same time embitters him." So I think that there are a lot of us who are aware that we're living under certain illusions. We want to be delivered from those illusions, but we want to be delivered from them on our own terms. And that, I think, is the best I can come to an explanation in brief of this very complex and, I think, very fascinating phenomenon. So I will leave it at that. Thanks very much for listening.
So now we've invited Professor Judith Wilt to give a short response, and thank you very much.
Wow, so much to talk about, and I'll only talk briefly, particularly about the kinds of authority, I think, that literature in its indirect way seems to be mustering. I'll start by saying that as a person of Roman Catholic faith, I've lived through the many reorientations of quite direct authority in that community, not just since Vatican II, but since I started school in the 1940s. When I listened to different interpretations, my second grade teachers and my sixth grade teachers and my eighth grade teachers and my high school teachers gave me about the different possibilities for salvation or not in my Jewish neighbors or of those godless communists across the ocean. I resisted all of that. On the other hand, as a scholar of literature, I've lived through the many reformulations of the way literature musters its special kinds of indirect authority. From the new criticism's suggestion that the careful ordering of images in plots and of sounds in music pretty much recapitulates all we can know about a possible divine order, through the early certainties of feminist and Marxist criticism that only literature which offers stark resistance to the ordinary order of the world and its infinitely corruptible churches deserves to be taken as authoritative, to the more recent cautions that Professor Jacobs notes, and which the cultural critic Giles Gunn characterized as the sediments of the sacred in the act of interpretation itself. This is a sediment which always pulls us, in reading any text, towards those elements of indecipherability, of incorrigibility, of alterity that have been the hallmark of religious seeking. So in my experience of both spheres, religious faith and literary faith, comfort comes only as I learn to recognize and name, reframe and make nervous friends of my doubts. When I was invited to give a talk to our graduate colloquium a few years ago on intersections and mutual patterns in religion and literature, I gave the talk a title, Heterodoxies, from a moment in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which illustrates some of the indirections that Professor Jacobs has been talking about. The orthodox Nellie Dean and the still more orthodox Mr. Lockwood in that novel are discussing at the end of it the rumored ghostly appearance of the dead lovers, Cathy and Heathcliff, who are themselves, as I'm sure you'll remember, the very picture of the incorrigible, the indecipherable, the alter. Nellie wonders if people like Cathy and Heathcliff are happy in the other world. Lockwood thinks that question somewhat heterodox. And Nellie, unsatisfied and uncowed, says they'll both just have to leave that question and the fate of the characters to the maker, capital M, of both. So I like the word somewhere in between orthodox and non-orthodox. I like the word heterodox for literature's way of exploring the matter of spirit and the structures of religion too, because the word points to the insistent manyness and ungraspable slipping and sticking in human affairs of matter and spirit, while it retains the bones of the word doxa. Doxa connects spirit feeling to history and to antiquity, where doxa have been the stuff of vision, and doxa still incite to vision, like the dry bones that stand up and walk in the valley in Ezekiel. Doxa are religious dogmas. Religious dogmas everyone thinks she knows until she tries them out, at which point they flame into bewildered aspiration, into fierce analysis, into tormenting paradox, into shattering strength and impossible comforts. Most of us first met Wuthering Heights and its heterodoxies in the classroom as an orthodox classic, but its first readers met it as Gothic horror, as popular culture, that most indirect form of literature's authority. So in the short time I have here to respond about my own history with literature as a carrier of religion as heterodoxy, I'd like to recommend three other types of popular culture that specially sustain my own religious quest and religious faith. These would be the historical novel, the science fiction novel, and detective stories. Well, the first two are connected, I guess. One is past history, the other future history, science fiction. And I feel surprisingly great comfort when I open a historical novel or a science fiction future history novel to discover that wherever that novel is situated, there is religious quest and controversy there. We tend to assume, I suppose, that religious quest and controversy has animated past worlds but has disappeared in future worlds. There are, of course, some historical novels where religious passion is presented as only limply affecting, if at all, the real lives of persons. Gone with the Wind would be one. But most of the best historical novels, to my mind, situate themselves where they can take this passion in character and culture seriously and study it with a maximum of modern intelligence and only the necessary minimum of modern irony. Sir Walter Scott's historical novels of politico-religious civil war between Anglican and Calvinist forms of Protestantism, or between Islam and Christian crusaders, for instance, tend to, in the end, dissolve religious controversy into a kind of wary tolerance. But along the way, in the middle of those novels, the study of the whole spectrum of types of believers, from the hypocritical and devious to the passionately sincere, is masterly. Professor Alan Wolfe, who runs this colloquium, and I actually share an admiration for another Scottish historical novelist named Dorothy Dunnett, also only recently dead, whose Renaissance novels convey an unparalleled interest and respect and engagement with the swirl of religious restoration and reform in both Christianity and Islam in those times. And here I would even recommend audaciously her 900-page novel of the 11th century, King Hereafter, which is a retelling of the Macbeth story as underlit by a clash of Viking and Christian imperatives in the culture of the times, which makes of the relationship between the fatalistic Norwegian-bred Macbeth and his Celtic Catholic priest and adult soul friend a thing of great agony and beauty. The future history of science fiction often features a surprising assumption of the survival, if sometimes in curious forms, of current religious practices, doctrines, and even institutions. Think of Dune, for instance, with its Bene Gesserit monasteries of sisters and its prophetic Islamic-inflected Fremen tribesmen. There's even, if you don't already know this, a robust tradition within science fiction of Jesuits in space. In James Bliss's A Case of Conscience, for instance, the Jesuit biologist Ruiz Sanchez discovers a new planet of conscious creatures who have built a civilization which is perfectly ethical, but without a belief in God. Could such be? Revisiting this same strenuous moral paradox in a more recent science fiction trilogy, Robert Sawyer creates an alternate universe of Neanderthal men which is totally green, totally nonviolent, and in its total acceptance of itself as a human animal culture requires no insistence on an afterlife special to humans, and can conceive of no higher power to which it must bow or to which it may aspire. The Catholic biologist who explores this society discovers that this is because Neanderthal brains have no God organ, that is, no space or synapse in their cranial folds and currents which correspond to the spaces and synapses in the human brain where some current scientists are speculating that the impulse to God finds purchase. What do these believers do when their doxa are so strongly challenged? You've got to turn the page. You've got to read. Finally, there's the detective story, which would seem to be a surprising kind of literature to go to for comfort and strength. And yet, in a famous essay, the poet W.H. Auden speculated that there's a mytho-religious catharsis offered in the typical English detective story. A peaceful and innocent society is shocked in those stories by an intimate murder. And then as suspect after suspect is illuminated, the society has to recognize that its innocent state before the murder was false. Everyone is actually guilty of something, but only one person is guilty of this particular murder. And in pursuing only the one who is guilty of the specific crime of the murder, the story produces, at the moment of recognition, a consoling and strengthening, if brief, vision of a truly innocent small society. You know, even the American Raymond Chandler, writing about the grittier American form of the detective story in the early 20th century, claimed for that form a quality of redemption. The crime lights up the city of sinners, for sure, he says, but down these mean streets, this is a famous remark, a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid, and that's the detective, and presumably the reader. In closing, I have a detective story I confess I reread all the time for comfort and for strength. It's Marjorie Allingham's The Tiger in the Smoke, a post-World War II English detective story. Its detective calls himself Albert Campion, back to the Jesuits again. But the true battle in this novel is between an aging and unassuming rector of a small city parish, Canon Averill, and the wonderfully named villain Jack Havoc, the only truly wicked man the novel's police inspector has ever seen. Jack Havoc is a powerful and intelligent man, haggardly hungry for everything the world has to offer, whose philosophy amounts to watch all the time and never do the soft thing. But in watching all the time for the lucky chance he believes he merits, in avoiding at all costs the soft thing, Havoc has committed murder after murder with nothing to show for it but the exhausting self-hardening of the philosophy itself. Canon Averill, whose faith is absolute, and whose character is exactly as we have just heard literature itself described, passionately analytic, but a surprise, non-dogmatic, without dreaming of direct proselytization. He confronts Havoc as a model and not a mentor. And for that reason, the enraged murderer's knife hesitates when he attacks him, and it misses his heart, leaving the wicked man to his final half-conscious choice of self-destruction. The strengthening for me of the reading experience here is in the exposure to an entirely plausible good man. The comfort for this reader in this reading this novel is in the rush of tears that always comes to me at the end, which is sorrow at the fate of the wicked man. Thank you.